Welcome to Teen Teach from the Cold Spring Harbor Public Library. Today I'm going to be teaching you about miniature painting. So miniature painting has a lot of different applications as a hobby, most commonly in board games, tabletop games in general, role-playing games. These are some miniatures for Dungeons & Dragons, in addition to war games like Warhammer, Bolt Action, things like that. It's very fun also just as an artistic endeavor, and many people pursue it in that light. So today I'm going to be painting one of these human paladins I got from our very own local Main Street Board Game Cafe in Huntington. And yeah, let's get to it. So, I'm going to do my best to just display a good range of the different techniques of the basic level. I'm not going to get too complicated today when it comes to miniature painting. So, gonna try to stick to only a few brushes. I have to bring in some other ones. These two you can see are about the same size. The only difference is that this is synthetic and this one isn't. And the only reason I have a synthetic brush with me here, in addition to my natural hair brush, is because when you're painting metallics, the ones that I have, and most good ones, are going to have small flecks of metal basically within them, which can actually tear up the bristles, which is less of an issue with a cheap, like, $4 brush than it is with a $15 brush. So that's basically that. So anyways, let's get into it. I think I'm gonna want to do for this guy maybe a red and blue color scheme, little gold trim, obviously gonna be some plate metal there. Yeah, so let's do that. So I'll use Ishtar Alpha Electric Blue for my blue, a bit of a brighter one. And I'm gonna start with a bit more interesting. This is an interesting paint, not necessarily a beginner paint, but still relatively easy to use, from scale 75. This particular one is Ball Crimson. And so I'm gonna start by doing the plate actually underneath here, for which I am going to use black metal, also from scale 75. So shake our paint, using a wet palette here, but you don't need a wet palette for it. It just tends to preserve your paints for a little bit longer. Get a small amount on the brush, and then get into painting it. So I'll try to bring this up here. Now what I'm going to do, since this is supposedly a pre-primed miniature, that's why I got it. I could probably remove those mold lines, but in this case, just doing a quick little tutorial, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. So when you're first applying a base coat, there's no other colors on the model, depending on the paint scheme you're doing. So obviously there's exceptions, say if you don't want a dark color over a portion which is going to end up being lighter, etc., etc. I'm also going to do the chainmail with this color. You know, you might want to preserve that lightness, but generally speaking, it doesn't really matter where the paint ends up. If you get a little bit on adjacent pieces, basically, it's not a huge deal. So, just trying to gently apply. The bristles are getting a bit messed up there. This is a common miniature painting trick where you use this webbing between your thumb and pointer finger and just pull it like that. Or you can use your mouth, which is, I think, what most people do, but personally, I think that's a bit gross. Don't like getting paint in my mouth. So yeah, we're just going to apply this base coat. Sorry, I shook the camera there a bit. And just try to get it, you know, around the areas where you want it, basically. You're not really pushing it around on the model. You're dragging it across. That's generally the action with these. Let's see if we can get a good look at that trim there. Looks about right. Put this on the sword. Do the sword next. I think Yeah, we'll keep this simple. I'll do this inner part in silver too. In metal, I guess. Not really silver. And just gently pull that down. I'm going to do my best here. You know, obviously it's optimal not to get too much everywhere, but it's not a huge deal if you do when you're first applying base coats. After that, you need to get into some precision work. But really, when it comes down to it, a lot of people somewhat marvel at different miniatures, you know, and how detailed the work gets. And that's true to some degree, but often what it comes down to is just technique. Once you get the techniques down, it's not that difficult. Anyone can do it. And there's a slew of different ones. So right now we're in the step called base coating, which again is just the first layer of paint, basically. We're going to get around to using washes, which are basically, they're not just thinned paints. They're a little different than that. They have usually different mediums that they're made up of. This one is going to be a bit more gold, but that's not a huge deal. And they are super useful, often called liquid talent in the miniature painting community, just because it makes everything look so much better. And I'll be using a bit of it just to try to keep things somewhat simple on the cloak. All right, so that looks like a good base coat there. Look around, see if there's any major steel parts. Doesn't, oh, I guess I can do these knee pads like in steel. So yeah, we're just gonna go around and paint, basically. Fairly straightforward when it comes to this stuff. You gotta get kind of careful. Again, later on, we're gonna be painting with several colors around this area, and we don't want to get different colors on each other. It gets a bit tedious, and you want to wash your brush somewhat frequently to keep the point healthy. This particular brush is already kind of sort of starting to not be in a great position, but I've had it for a while. So I'm just gonna get in there. Kind of want to preserve that color there. All right, that should be good for now. I'll do these elbow pads too. So you can get as intricate as you want with this stuff. I mean, you could go paint every little minor detail a different color, and some people do that. But generally, especially because the majority application is for tabletop, you know, for use in games, there's what's called tabletop standard, TTS, which is basically good enough to be on the board. Because in a lot of cases, you know, fundamentally speaking, miniatures are designed as gaming pieces. They're supposed to represent a thing. And so there's a bit of controversy, I suppose you could say, when it comes to miniature design, whether to keep it more simplistic or get more detailed. And people generally, I think, buy more detailed miniatures, but there's definitely a large camp that is against that. I mean, things get pretty detailed. And you have things like this guy who's a work in progress here. As you can clearly see, there's a lot of unpainted parts to him, and parts that are base coated but nowhere near done. There's a hair floating around too, but clearly a bit more detail than this guy. Also a different scale. But then you also have miniatures. I mean, really, it just depends on the world you're playing in. I mean, with these orcs, you know, they can stand to be a bit more goofy looking than, say, this Poxwalker. Because a Poxwalker is a bit more intimidating, and you probably want that a bit more serious looking. But, you know, I think it just depends on what your own personal preference is. Everything comes down to personal preference. So, I want to do this larger cloak in, I think we'll do the cloak in blue on the inside, red on the outside. Yeah, I like the thought of that. So, mix up our paints. you want to keep your paints well mixed and also well thinned. The paints I happen to be using right now happen to be very thin already, so I don't need to do much thinning with them. As you see, I've switched to the natural hairbrush. But, you know, it's always better to have 2 thin coats than 1 thick coat, and that's just a general rule. So I'm not going to worry too much about making the shading on this super realistic. You know, there's an extent you can go with it. You know, you can go as close or as far from reality as you want. And I think that's what the beauty about it is. There's a lot of versatility in painting style, even though it may seem a bit more boxed in. It's really nice detail work in general. I think people who have a mind for details, who like paying close attention to things. I mean, I know before I got into miniature painting, I would love looking at those dioramas in museums. Those were always very fascinating to me, thinking about how many hours it took to make those, and now I kind of know that firsthand. You know, miniature painting tends to be adjacent to other somewhat related hobbies like, you know, model making, things like cars and planes and whatnot, things like terrain making for games, things like, oh, I don't know, dioramas, trains, model trains, very similar sort of group in general. Oh, and I guess, yeah, well, that counts as model makers, but those model ship makers, that you have to have a lot of respect for that, because they have to rig those tiny little things, and that's just incredibly impressive to me. I mean, I'm struggling just to get this paint to go on nicely and cleanly. So I'm going to do this trim. I want to keep this trim blue. So now here we're going to get into the realm of where I want to be a bit more careful. The Ishtar Alpha paint is a bit thinner than the Scale 75 paint in this particular scenario, so I don't mind, you know, I'm going to put that on first and not care too much about where I get it, because it's going to be harder for me to control it, generally, I think. I mean, I could try if I wanted to, but it's less of a big deal. It's going to be easier for me, my personal opinion, is that it's easier to paint the trim first on something like this, and then go in there and paint the center. So we're also going to do the trim here on this. I don't even know what's going on here, to be honest. It's a little weird. Loincloth, I suppose. I know there's a name for it. I'm somewhat into the whole medieval arms and armory type stuff, but I don't know too much about it. I would not hazard a guess as to what this is called. I'm sure there's a name for it. Yeah, this is probably not wholly accurate to the model, but we can take a little creative liberty. That's the glory of miniature painting, is that you can have fun with it. See, I'm just going to try to be very careful to slowly draw my brush across there. I'm trying to also get this on camera, so I'm painting in a very awkward position. Very, very uncomfortable. Oh, God. All right. Wonderful. Got that nice in there, you know, nice fun stuff. So now we're going to have to just try to pull this across here very, very carefully. And, you know, when it gets to these sort of areas that you're never going to see, I mean, honestly, you know, not so much in this model. It's not as big of a deal. But there's certain models where it's just like you're never going to ever see a particular area of the model. And there are people out there take a very similar ethos to that. Oh God, I won't remember his name, but this guy who did he's like a woodworker, famously did this one church in London with this huge floral arrangement. I might be saying this is sort of a hot pink, but we're going to shade it. It's going to be fine. Huge floral arrangement, right? going on a wall. And, you know, there's so much of it that you're never going to see. There's so much of it that was facing the wall that it was mounted on. There'd be no point in sculpting that, you would think. But he spent the time, which I imagine he wasn't getting paid extra to do it, spent the time sculpting the whole back of the piece. No one would ever see it. Huge, huge thing, gotta get mounted on this church wall. No one ever see it. And his whole ethos was, God will see it. I'm not religious personally, but I think that's an interesting sort of thing, just kind of work for work's sake. I mean, if you're submitting something to a contest, they will probably, like when it comes to miniature painting, they will probably look at those sort of detailed areas. But, when it comes to just painting for yourself, it's not really necessary. But some people do it. Some people go in there and get the little skull that's hiding in an armpit or whatever that you'll never see, but, they know they did it. And I respect that. It's an interesting philosophy about these things. So as you can see, I'm going to have to do extra layers here, but that's also okay because I'm going to be shading this. Not with the shade, though. Woohoo. Getting a little sneaky on you. So this is an interesting sort of color palette we got here. If you don't know, red and blue are the colors of the Catholic Church. I saw this guy and it was just kind of like, he sort of looks like some sort of Templar. He is a paladin. Paladins and Dungeons and Dragons are really just, they're holy warriors. So decided to go with this red and blue paint scheme, but I'm going a little more electric with it. I can definitely bring this to a point where it looks more red. I might not do that. I might just decide not to do that. We'll see. But his whole getup here is kind of odd to me. I don't know what really is going on. But, I'll keep this somewhat detailed. I'm not going to go crazy with it. It's interesting when you look at a lot of fantasy photos, say, for reference material, or just because you're one of those people that likes looking at fantasy art, which I will not wholly deny is me. You can see there's a lot of design choices that aren't necessarily the best or make the most sense. I don't know if I necessarily see that here, but that's just a general thing you'll notice, is that historical and practical inaccuracy is pretty common with this stuff. Even when you think, this is probably being made by people who are enthusiastic about these things, and you generally be right, but that's not always the case. Sometimes people make design decisions just because it looks cool, and also because, it is fantasy, so practicality is not always your number one concern. But, I'm going to try to keep it real here. As you can see, I'm going to go to this little trim here, try to get that done nicely. All right, that's looking pretty good. I am relatively confident-ish with how that looks. So, now I am going to do the leather. I'm going to wait for this to dry, and then I can put in a second coat later. But right now I'm going to do the leather. So for the leather, I am going to use a contrast paint, and this is something that, I think actually, this brand calls them antithesis paints. Just contrast paints in disguise, basically. Contrast is a Citadel. They're pretty big brand in miniature painting, although, I don't know, they're kind of meh in my opinion. Contrast paint, basically what this allows you to do is, the idea is that it's a shade and your highlight and your base coat all in one, is the idea. Hopefully you can get your models out on the table a bit faster. This one's kind of a thicker contrast paint. It's more interesting to me. I like this one more just because it has more pigment, but the Citadel ones do have their uses. So, what we're going to do is simply, sort of like what we're doing with everything else, just kind of lay it on there. But this one, we want to draw out a lot more. You can get a lot more out of this. I'll paint that a little bit gold later, but for now, we'll just try to keep this from getting on everything else. And this particular one, honestly, is a bit better for just wood. But, you know, if you don't have it in contrast with anything else in the model, like I'm not painting wood on anything else in this model, so it's not a huge deal to me. I don't know, maybe to you, I don't know. That would... Sorry. But, yeah, this is a particularly nice color for doing wood effects. You know, just lay this down, tiny bit of highlighting with, like a peachish color or something like that, and it turns out really nice. I'm just gonna try to lay it on there nice and good. You can see we're developing a good pigment. Got a little too much there, so just put it on his arm. And yeah, so pretty straightforward, generally speaking, miniature painting is. You know, it's really just a matter of base coat, wash, dry brush for a lot of things, you know, the more simplistic way of looking at it, or highlight. So what a dry brush is basically just removing the majority of the paint from the brush before applying it to the model. And what that allows you to do is just sort of run the brush across the model and just do the highlights. It's a very popular technique, simply because it makes everything really, really easy to do. Something like this, I'm probably going to do a bit of dry brushing on this leather, just to make it look a bit nicer. Although I might not. What it allows you to do is kind of quickly and easily get highlights, which under normal circumstances is not something that's quick and easy to do. Because it's kind of difficult to get all those little nooks and crannies, or I guess technically the opposite of nooks and crannies, whatever that may be. You know, if you're doing that by hand, each and every little highlight, it can get a bit tedious. I could see not wanting to do that. And generally I don't. If you look, for example, what I was thinking about painting for this and didn't, this skeleton, which I just did in like 20 minutes, that's a lot of dry brushing. And, you know, I could paint that by hand and try to get that to look good, but, I mean, obviously I'm still painting it by hand, but I could do conventional highlighting to do that, but it would look a lot worse, I think, and take a lot longer. So, you know, as a speediness thing, and also as an appearance thing, it can look really good. Kind of similar effect you get with stippling, which is basically where you just kind of smack a brush on it, usually like a pointier, older, not very good brush, smack it on the model to get this kind of weathered effect. Weathering is also like a thing in a lot of, you know, not only in miniature painting, but I think especially in model making, which is, again, basically just dry brushing. Often if you look at like weathering pigments, they'll be made to be very like dry, almost like powders, and then you'll get that on a brush and then lightly brush it over the model, and that'll create a weathered effect. You know, get this kind of sparse highlighting destruction sort of thing. That looks, yeah, I missed a spot there, which is kind of annoying, but no matter, time to address it. You can always just wipe away a lot of your mistakes, just like real life. Just forget about it, basically. You can just, bam, it's gone. Out of sight, out of mind. So, I'm gonna go in there and do the trim around here again. Clearly did not pick that part up. Okay, there's gonna be a bit of redoing here. I'm just kind of, I want to get this done. Wonderful. I'm gonna get like blue under there, not only because that's how I was painting it before, but also because it's a nice dark color that if you were for some reason looking at this miniature from this angle, wouldn't stand out too much. So that's why I tend to use the darker color to do the inside of a trim, you know, the inside of a cloak or something, just because I think it looks better in general. It's going to turn out making more sense, and you're not going to be able to notice it as much. So as you can see, you know, if I just paint this whole inner area blue, you know, from a distance, from most angles, you're not really going to notice that. So not a huge deal. So other techniques in miniature painting, common ones, well, this is a good piece just to show some stuff on. This is a cloak for a person I was working on. This is actually just using a contrast paint on a zenithal primed model, which is zenithal priming is something like this, where it's you prime it black, then do gray from an angle, and then white from the top. So that's how I got that easy shadow. And this sort of transition was done using something called wet blending, which is basically you're blending the colors together while they're still wet, as the name would entail. So yeah, let me finish this up. I'm gonna try to keep this relatively simple, not get too crazy with it. Not necessarily do every single detail, because that's not always necessary and usually isn't. And you know, in this case, like let's say here, right? Contrast paints you generally want to use while it's still white, because then it'll show up better. But you can use it when it's not like all white. You can use it in situations where it isn't, where there's little bits of stains, especially on something like this where you don't really care too much, because it'll still, you know, you can go in there later with your conventional paints and fix it up. So miniature painting it's a great hobby. I wouldn't say it's really tedious, but definitely is time consuming in a lot of cases. It depends on what you're painting. It depends on how simple the model is, or complex, either way. You know, however complicated your model is, the more complicated it is, the more difficult it's going to be to paint. The more time it's going to take. All right. So I'm going to do these straps also in this color, just because I think they work like that. Actually, they kind of look a bit more hempen, but no matter. No one has to know. All right, so I think we're going to go in here and do another coat. See, I'm getting a little flecks of hairs and whatnot in there. It's a little bothersome. And this time, I'm going to take extra care to just paint within the lines. Honestly, in many ways, miniature painting can be like just like a coloring book, but a lot more complicated, 3D, and much more difficult. So I guess not at all. It's interesting though, because it's not like, you know, it really is just, what level do you want it, you know? Do you want absolute perfection, or do you want basically perfection? Because basically perfection is honestly pretty close and almost good enough. So I'm gonna try to keep this trim pretty nice, but I don't really care too much. Especially when I'm not really using this paladin for anything. He's just gonna be thrown in the foam box with all the other D&D miniatures I have, because I can't play D&D because of, you know, pandemic. So, not too concerned. But, you know, other pieces you might want to spend a bit more time to make them that much better. If it's gonna be, say, a prominent piece in a collection or an army, you know, you might want to spend that extra time. I definitely like, it's not, okay, I can get a finished model. You know, I spent a ton of time getting this character to look good, because he's going to be a prominent figure in my army. I spent a ton of time doing this careful edge highlighting, and this OSL, which is still not very good. OSL is Object Source Lighting, basically, you know, trying to make it look like it's casting light, which sort of shows up here. But really, when it comes down to it, is just how good do you want it? What matters to you? This guy mattered to me, so I wanted to make him look good. I spent a lot of time on making him look good. I didn't even paint him fully assembled. I painted him in sub-assemblies because he came in parts. And I decided not to put it together before I painted it, which is a common decision. So, now that that's sort of done, we're letting that dry, we are going to go back to our synthetic brush, and we're going to go with some gold. And for this, let's see, I'm kind of everywhere with the brands today. I'm going to use Dark Star Molten Metals. These are, well, obviously from Dark Star Mini Company. I think these are the guys who make some sort of game, I'm pretty sure. Never played it, but I think they make a game. Some war game of some sort, I think. I don't really know. But I do know that I like their gold, so I use it. Alright, and again, just pretty straightforward. Now that this is going to be a lot of trim work. And, yeah, with this particular one, I'm just doing the trim later, just because I felt like it. I mean, really, it comes down to personal preference and what you feel like most of the time for most of these models. Like with this, I'm just going to do a little gold around here. I might come back later and try to make that look like a gemstone, but I don't know, might not. It's not a huge deal if I don't. But I think I will. I'm going to make this whole thing gold. It's weirdly thin. I don't know if I mixed this enough. And you can hear this particular one has some ball bearings of some sort in there to help mix things up. That's an interesting aspect to the Scale 75 paints, and why I don't necessarily recommend them for beginners is that they come sealed, so you have to poke a hole in the top, which often you have to really get down a technique because it's almost always going to waste some paint. And also doesn't have any sort of mixer in them, so you have to add that yourself with the Scale 75 paints. And they're also a bit thinner, so, you know, when you're first starting out, thin paints might be a bit intimidating to you. You're not necessarily ready to do several coats like you need to, which is fair. I mean, you can still make a model look good without doing several coats, but to make a model look really good, you gotta go for that several coat method. And so now we're gonna just basically, yeah, it looks pretty good. Got a little gold in there. And let's add a little more on the shoulder pauldrons. Okay, they're just pauldrons. They're not shoulder pauldrons. I mean, I guess they are on the shoulder, but I think pauldrons are just this particular piece. I mean, honestly, yeah, those are pauldrons. I don't know. Would you call that a knee pauldron? I don't think so. I think pauldrons are just the things in the shoulders. It's a fun word, pauldron. Very common place to see used as for just general design. Oh, so that's looking pretty good. For design fun, I think a lot of people like using the pauldrons. A lot of people meaning like designers of miniatures and characters and whatnot, because you can fit a lot of characterization into a pauldron. This particular one does not, but you can put insignia, like Space Marines often have that. You know, designs can be interesting, represent, you know, certain parts of the character's history. They provide a lot of the bulk of the shoulders, which of course, you know, makes that look all that more intimidating. Just a very generally interesting little part of a piece of armor. Armor in general is a pretty cool thing. And I'm sorry this is off in the corner, but it's kind of hard to get it under the camera and also be able to paint it. at the same time. But here we go. We'll try it. I'm just gonna try to like be very, very careful about that. About where I'm putting my brush. Yeah, we're kind of in the end game here when it comes to the base coating, so we're gonna want to be very careful. So at this point is when we're gonna get into washes. You don't have to use washes. In fact, interestingly, if you buy like the paint sets from Scale 75, they come with like little tutorials, which, hold on, I should have one over here, let me look. Little tutorials, which don't even mention washes, probably because the washes don't come in their paint sets, so they're not really advertising that. Makes sense. But we can get a look-see at our model so far. Go over that face now. But, yeah, here we go. So, come with these little guides, tell you how to paint. Not very well, though. The guides are a little weird. I want to give this guy a bit of an olive skin tone, I guess, what I'm going to go for, I think. Maybe not. We'll start with just like a, yeah, this kind of color, and I want to keep it simple. I'm not going to go too crazy with the face. Faces are often the hardest part of miniature painting. Even for, get a little soap on there. Even for experienced painters, faces are difficult because they're tiny and easily recognizable. It's kind of a human psychology thing where, like, you know, we're kind of trained to see faces, so you know when a face is wrong pretty much instantly. You know, you can see it's kind of honestly the thing with like just generally like sculpting. Trying to sculpt people is a lot more difficult than trying to sculpt like, you know, creatures, because it's very, very prone to sort of uncanny valley type thing where it's sort of right but not really, because you can tell instantly because we're just so used to looking at people and we know what they should look like. You know, they should have a face. You know, coloration doesn't really matter, but it's the shape that matters the most. And often when you're painting that shape, certain things will be raised and lowered depending on how you paint it. That'll make it confusing to the human eye if it looks off. Like this guy's actually starting to look like a bit of an idiot. His face is getting a little weird, and there's a lot of paint caking up because I did not thin my paint properly. That looks okay. I'll give him like, I don't know, black hair, let's say. So, you know, honestly, my ethos is just kind of gonna wing it, honestly. You know, there's a prescribed way to do skin properly to get the tones really right. But you could also just, again, lay down a base color. So if you're doing darker skin, you know, actually with darker skin, honestly, you might want a lighter brown because sometimes whatever you're painting with will discolor it. Like whatever shade you use will discolor it. But with lighter skin, you know, just go with like a lighter flesh tone, put your wash down, leave it. Honestly, a lot of people try to do the eyes. I generally do. But it's not always recommended. Like, it's not always a good idea to go for the eyes because the eyes are really prone to looking wacky. And that's a common, you know, meme in the miniature painting community is the eyes looking ridiculously weird and being incredibly difficult to paint. I mean, even like, look at this. Like, even the eyes here look a little dumb in a lot of ways. So it is what it is. All right, so this guy's looking okay. Sorta, kinda, I guess. We're gonna go try to paint that base. And for that base, I am going to use... What should I use? What should I do? I will just mix some gray with my black. If you're looking into getting into miniature painting, why else would you be watching a video like this? If you're looking into getting into miniature painting, there's quite a bit of supplies at the Board Game Cafe, which is nice and convenient. Although they have somewhat limited set of when it comes to like paints. I mean, they have definitely everything you need to get started, but maybe only enough to get started, like specific models. But, you know, a set of sort of cheaper army painter paints only set you back like, I think like $90 for like 70 of them. It's pretty dirt cheap. Not the case for Scale 75. Scale 75, really quite expensive. You'll get like 10 paints for like $30, which I guess isn't terrible, but, you know, not cheap for sure. And it's like usually 10 paints of like one tone too, which is kind of annoying. So I'm just going to try to quickly cover this base in as much gray as I can. And it might end up looking a bit more black. Probably because I need to add more gray. There we go. So, looking good. Looking pretty good. Not amazing, but not terrible. Half decent. So, let's start with shading. There's a couple details in the sword there, but I mean, you can ignore those, honestly. They'll blend in fine. What I'm going to use is some Citadel shades. These are honestly the best thing they make, in my opinion. Not too much there. Basically, what this allows us to do is to give it some shade. It'll darken the dark areas, make the light areas look a bit more raised. All good fun stuff. And you can often use this to get like, make the metal stand out a bit more, just for like, from light theory purposes. I don't know. Yeah. So, that's, I think, all about the Nuln oil I'm going to use, and I'll move over to the Hydrax Birch Shade. This is more of a kind of brownish color. Use that here. And so look at that. I mean, looks a lot better very quickly with literally just painting this over it. And that's why this is Liquid Talent, because it makes it look better without you having to be too good. I'll put on the armor here. Wonderful. Now I'm going to do the gold with some Reichland Flush Shade. And the face. Now this is more of a light brown, closer to a red. Very good for making golds look kind of vibrant. But, I mean, you know, certain golds you might want to do with Nuln oil or a dark shade of some variety. It really depends. There's different types of golds, different types of colors within colors within colors. So it comes down to color theory, really. And, you know, understanding how paint works is an important part of miniature painting. Of any painting, really, is understanding how pigmentation works, how mediums work, how they work in tandem with each other. gets really interesting and sciencey and whatnot. We're going to use a red tone for our cloaks, both on the blue and the red, because that's just the way I roll. All right. A little more. Now I'll give this inner area a bit more of a purplish hue, which I kind of like. Oh my. So, there we go. Looking pretty good. I'm going to touch up that gold a bit, but we're going to leave this to dry for now and then come back to it later. So, yeah. Alright, so it's been some time since we finished doing our base coat and wash, and as we can see, there's some parts that we're going to need to touch up here, but generally we're looking pretty good. Across the board, I think this miniature's turning out well. So the next things I think I want to address are, there's a bit of chipping here, which is a bit of an issue, so we're just going to highlight that. I can show you a bit about highlighting while fixing that. And then we're gonna, this base part didn't get like fully base coated. There's a lot of white in unraised areas, so we're gonna rebase coat this, and then we're gonna dry brush this, and that'll be interesting. And while I kind of like how this looks, I think we're gonna take a shot at trying to dry brush this cape here. It's gonna look a lot more weathered and worn, which, you know, it's definitely a look. I don't know if it's what you would want, but yeah, we're gonna do a bit of a dry brush in here, just very light. Other than that, we're probably going to raise the gold a little bit using some of this braid gold. Remember, we base coated with Regency gold. And that should be about it. Then I think we might do a little bit of messing around with the sword here and raising that color up on the edges too. But yeah, so far, generally, we are looking pretty good. I did touch up other few small parts that got all chipped. So, let's get to it. Let's start with the gold, why not? Get a bit on our palette. All right. And remember, if you are working with natural brushes, natural bristle brushes, switch to your synthetic brush when putting on metals. It can damage your real brushes, which is less of an issue in the long term for these because they're cheap, but with your real ones, it could be an issue. So we're just going to try to like get the raised edges here, and that's where I want to keep it. So I'm just gonna draw it along there and try to, we want to keep our shadows maintained if possible, in order to get a realistic effect here. I mean, it'll be a little hard on this, in this particular scale, to get really nice, and this miniature is kind of medium quality, but I think we can get it to look pretty good. I think the camera angle might be a bit different. I did knock the camera a tad when I was setting up again, and did not know where I had it, so I had to reset it. But there we go, generally just raising those edges, getting them nice and lit. Good. And so you can see I'm taking a very light touch when doing this. It's not quite a dry brushing because there's still, plenty of paint on the brush. But it is just a very light application to raise those edges. I'm going to do it on the corners here. Just kind of running it along the edge. This is also called the edge highlighting, especially when it's something like this with very sharp corners. It's edge highlighting. It's how you get an effect, somewhat like This is a work in progress, so it doesn't look great, but like that. I have better examples around. I can show one in a bit. But, yeah, so just gently running this along the edge here. Try to raise it up and get a good look at the lighting. Now, again, I think I've mentioned this. You can go super realistic with the lighting, or you could just try to hit everything with color. You know, it really just depends on your skill level. I'm not good enough to make everything look super realistic, so I like to just hit it in a pretty decent amount and get a good color going. But there are definitely those out there who can make things look a lot better. One of the things about miniature painting, you come to respect it a lot because, you know, there is a big difference between levels of it. I mean, you learn as you go along. I would say most miniature painters are self-taught. You know, there's not really many places to learn except for on the internet. All right, that's pretty good. There's a little bit too light in the corner here. A little too much. But also remember, we didn't have like a proper primer on this. This is one of those pre-primed models that I'm so-so. I'm not sure how much I like that, but it seems like the paint's going on okay. Minimal issues, broadly speaking. So I'm just going to use this leather brown very thinly. I could switch to my real hairbrush, but I don't think that's really necessary, just to try to touch up this spot. And then I'll come in here with a shade later and fix it. And I'm just going to use it lightly here, try to cover up that blue marking. And again, very lightly, because I'm almost using this as a highlight. Just gonna cover that up here. Sweet. So obviously now there's a degree to which you can go into the, oh, that's not getting focused there. There's a degree to which you can go into the details. You could paint every little belt buckle if you wanted to, but I find that to be inefficient, especially because usually when you're looking at a miniature, it's from like this, like this distance. So, you know, I mean, usually it's going to be on a board. So if it looks good from a distance, that's what matters the most, in my opinion. But obviously, you know, it's definitely appealing to get up in there and have it look really nice up close too, which is kind of, preferably we want both. I think that's one of the things people critique a lot, these more complicated Games Workshop miniatures, you know, compared to how, well, miniatures in general, compared to how they looked in the olden days of the 80s. And because, you know, in that time, they tended to use a lot more, you know, simply just because of the materials they were working with and just often lack of skill. Well, that's not always the case. They would use more, you know, rounder, cartoonish looking miniatures. They tended to not look as like realistic or highly detailed. And some people like that just because it looks better as a playing piece in a lot of cases. But, you know, I'm mixed on that personally. I think both can look good in their own contexts. There's a context for each. But you do see, especially in like Kickstarter board games, some ridiculously over-sculpted miniatures, which on a board just look ridiculous. But this guy is pretty good. I mean, this is a nice balance of sculpting level and, you know, reasonability. I mean, you see that definitely more so with these sort of humanoid characters. They tend to be a bit easier to do in a reasonable way, but often you'll see like huge monsters get ridiculously, like too many notes. It's just not good. All right, good. So we put that base coat in there again. It looks a little way on the screen. That's just because it's shiny. It looks fine in person. And so we're going to wait for that to dry a bit. And as we're waiting for that to dry, we're going to hit the face and this metal. So I'm going to stick with the synthetic brush for now. One thing of note, which I haven't been doing just because I haven't, a common way to hold miniatures while you paint them is this is just poster putty, and this is like a, I don't know, herb jar, you know, something you get cinnamon or whatever in. and you just stick it on top like that and use that as a handle. Right now I'm not going to do that just because for the sake of, well, I don't know, you might not necessarily, reducing the tools you would need, just to show you can do this with not too much except for brushes and paints. But that's always a fun way of holding them together. They also make stands to put them in, which have little adjustable stuff. All right, get a little bit of this light skin, and we're just gonna try to go in there and just very, very thinly gonna try to attack those edges in a way that turns out a little better. Honestly, with this scale, I want to reduce the size I'm working with as a brush, but I'll lay this down a bit first. Because I was hoping to do more of an olive skin tone here. I just really want this on the most raised of the edges. So that looks a little bad now. We're going to wash this off, grab the real brush. There's a little blue in there still. And just pull that around. Try to keep it on the raised edges and away from the shadows, if possible. We're actually going to go in here later and do shadows. All right, that's pretty good. We got a good highlighting going there. Around the eyes, a little weird. All right. Pretty good. We're not going to go too crazy with this guy, but I kind of want to give him a beard. Just a little shadow of one. So I'm going to get a very loose and sort of wet amount of paint on here. Give him a nice 5 o'clock shadow. By just kind of get a little more water in there. Just kind of coating his chin with this. Get that to focus. And we want that a little bit lighter, so we're going to just mix that with this. That should give us takes a good amount of focus to really get these going nicely. So we're getting into more of a shaded area there, so I don't mind a bit darker. Again, trying to stick with how light actually reacts with, its environment. Just bring this into focus. We're just kind of shading in here. And I'm going to do this little edge here. It's a little too dark. I mean, too light. There's no shadow there. Hard to bring that to focus. You try to film videos like this, you get a lot more respect for people who do this well, which is not me. There we go. So we got a nice little half-decent beard going on there. It looks a little wonky, but our base feels pretty dry. Obviously painting this way, the main issue is wiping off paint, but for right now, I don't care too much about this base because we are going to go in with a dry brush base. I don't care if the raised edges are a bit wonky. I'm going to grab this brush. This is from Ammo. It's just a brush like this. This is honestly a bit on the larger side, probably a bit too big. This could be used probably for either dry brushing or other purposes. But I'm gonna start with a little Necromancer Cloak, which is a good solid gray color. I think there was a gray darker than this from this company, but I just haven't bought another bottle of it, which I probably should do. So I'm just using a normal paper towel here, and we're just wiping off pretty much all of that paint. And then we're gonna just go on here and lightly brush that over. So obviously, you know, when you first do a coat of this, not going to look like all that much. But as you build it up, you get a nice shadow going. Especially useful for stone. And this is honestly, again, just an easy way to make details stand out. Like, for example, if you were doing this leather without a contrast paint, which you could easily do, you would start with a dark tone and then just dry brush lighter tones of like browns on there until you got it to look like that. So yeah, looks pretty good for that first layer. We're gonna move up to mixing a bit of this uniform gray with the Necromancer Cloak. Just gonna get a little on there. Again, we want to keep this nice and light. Very lightly, you know, we don't want to get any, if it's possible, into the, I'll try to bring this up, into the nooks and crannies, because that's gonna reduce our verisimilitude, so to speak. It's just not gonna look as realistic, and it can take you out of the model if you're trying to go for a more realistic look, which I think we're gonna go for. You know, this is a little bright, but it's a nice, like, sword and, well, not sword and sorcery, but, you know, a lighter fantasy genre, so to speak. You know, just classic fantasy, Tolkien type stuff, I suppose. Not too realistic. We're not going gritty, like, I don't know, Conan or something like that. We're just gonna keep this light. But still, a little bit, not too cartoonish. You know, we can use bright colors. There's definitely, you know, you can paint, and now you can definitely see with this lightest coat of gray coming out. There's different ways to paint miniatures depending on the style you're going for. I mean, it's like any art, you know, it's all about what style you want to go with. Just check my watch there. So, you know, especially if you're mimicking particular fantasies of the miniatures, you want the setting, you know, there's the thing of the implied narrative, which sounds very highfalutin, but if you think about it, it's pretty straightforward. It's just, you know, what story is the miniature telling? You know, when I see a miniature like this looks a lot more serious. I'm going to paint this, you know, again, I prefer just kind of like a high fantasy type thing, a bit brighter colors, just because I find that fun. But this guy looks very serious. When I finish him, instead of what this is at, I'm going to add, you know, a good amount of shade, a good amount of, you know, probably blood on this blade. You know, he's going to look serious as opposed to, you know, an orc. Orcs are goofy. That's just kind of how they are. It really depends on your setting, and it matters when you paint the miniature, you know, looking at the miniature. What is this miniature? What are the vibes, I guess you could say, it's giving off? That's what it comes down to, really. So, now we are looking pert good. I think this guy is nearing completion. We might try taking a stab at the eyes. That's sometimes a risky move, and often not something I'd recommend beginners actually do, especially because if you can see eyes from this far away, this was a person, if you could see the whites of their eyes, that would be a bit of a concern. I mean, think like Bunker Hill. The whole reason it was whites of their eyes is because that would mean that they're pretty freaking close. So we're gonna avoid that. This is, by the way, heavy metal. Heavy metal, with an apostrophe, is actually the name of Games Workshop's very famous miniature painting studio, which paints all the stuff you see on box art for them, so that's pretty cool. So this, I'm actually going to do more stippling here. I don't want to get it all off, so I want to keep it a little bit wet. And stippling, I'm just going to kind of, in this case, it's a little borderline, but I'm just going to kind of punch at it and try to make it look like it's a little scratched up. And this is also raising those highlights, and I think that looks pretty good. Sweet. So that's basically what stippling is in a nutshell. And yeah, I mean, there's a little white spots here, but this is generally looking good. I want to dry brush the back of this cloak, but first I'm going to go to a whiter metal color. This is Speed Metal. Interesting name. Most of these paints have very high fantasy type, or, you know, somewhat ridiculous, you know, depending on the genre of the company. Usually these are made by people who also make miniatures. Depending on what they tend to do, you'll get names based on that. It's a little bit too much of paint there. Get a little bit more off. So, you know, sometimes they'll be fantastical sounding, orc blood, I don't know, dragon scales, things like that. But it's nice occasionally to get like a normal name like purple, which is honestly, in my opinion, preferable. Just tell me what you're doing. But, you know, that's why kind of like, if it wasn't based in Cyprus and took forever to ship these things, war colors are nice because they named them, you know, real color names, and then just have like scales of opacity and things like that and brightness. Very cool to me. Not often you see that, which is kind of a shame. So we're gonna move away from the metals now. This is a very like light, like wet paint, just in general. So it's gonna be a bit weird trying to dry brush with this, I feel, but I'll try my best. You know, just get a little white on there and then just try to get the wetness up into it. It's not a very dry paint, but white tends to be very chalky, so it should balance that out. And this is gonna be a mix of like highlighting and dry brushing, what I'm about to do. And I'm just gonna, oh yeah, not good enough. So this particular white from War Paints tends to be very chalky indeed. So that should allow us to dry brush with it. But we'll see. I have not tried dry brushing with this particular paint color, so I don't know if we will be able to succeed on this. Because I tend to move towards highlighting now as I've gotten better as a technique. But dry brushing is still very important and very useful. Let me be clear. So this, I want to get a good amount off and then just kind of run it along the top. Yeah, see, this is a little bit too light, but that's a bit too pink for my liking. But we're gonna go over this one more time, I think, with a red coat, which should get it to be a bit redder, hopefully. So I'm gonna do that while it's still kind of wet as it, ooh, as wet as it is on there. But yeah, let's hit that with a red coat. Get a different palette. So many palettes. Grab my red, shake it up, get out here, and just brush that on there. Because I think when I get this on there, and there's a lot of experimentation in miniature painting, because unless you're painting a whole army of a very specific type, you know, each miniature is going to be different. And so you want to kind of get down various techniques in your repertoire. There we go. I think that looks good. I think we're going to call this miniature done. Wait for that to dry. It's going to look a bit, you know, maybe not as nice as before, but a little grittier, a little fun. And yeah, so I'll, you know, put in a picture of it when it's all dried up. But other than that, that is how you paint miniatures. Just wanted to quickly add that you should definitely seal up your miniatures with a coating like this one. But other than that, yeah,